Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Criterion Corner, where we take a look at the Criterion collection, film by film, and ask ourselves, why is this film important? And today we'll be taking a look at Charlie Chaplin's 1940 directorial film, The Great Dictator. And so to begin this discussion of the anti-fascist film, The Great Dictator, we have to look at the past, more specifically 1930s America. The world has changed. The Great Depression has happened, people are on the streets in Hoovervilles, and, well, people are starving. And the world itself has also changed because of the stock market crash in 29. Germany has been rising to power with the likes of Hitler and authoritarianism, and in America, like-minded individuals are also on the rise with the rise of the American Nazi Party. The Nazi Party in America is not something that's normally talked about in American history books, but is something that should be studied. Now, in terms of Hollywood's reaction to Hitler's rise to power, it was very much of a different story, because you have a lot of studio heads that were very much against telling Jewish stories, or even having films that were anti-Nazi at the time, mostly because they didn't want to inadvertently cause a Second World War with Germany. They did not want to force America into war because of a film that Hitler just so happened to watch. Which kind of reminds me of what happened with The Interview, which is a separate film altogether about Kim Jong-un and all that stuff, but that's an entirely different story. But it's basically the same thing. A lot of big studios did not want to actually make films that had anti-fascist propaganda. That is, until Warner Brothers in 1939 made a film called Confessions of a Nazi Spy, which took a look at fascism and the Nazi Party in a much more, let's say, critical light. Confessions of a Nazi Spy laid down the groundwork for what would become one of cinema's most iconic political satire films of all time, with Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. Now, The Great Dictator, as a production history, was kind of interesting, considering the fact that prior to this movie, he was mostly seen as a comedian. He was from the silent era, and this was in fact, his first talkie film, a film with sound, which is revolutionary, I know. Charlie Chaplin, at this point in time, was not necessarily unfamiliar with putting politics within his work. He created some short films back in the 1920s where he pretty much criticized, within his comedy, the act of using children as child labor, mostly because as a child himself, when he was a kid, he was actually forced into labor because his mother couldn't pay the bills, which is very upsetting. And then we get to modern times, which was a critique in of itself about industrialization and the Henry Ford assembly line process. Hell, even in that film, there was a stand-in for Henry Ford. But then we come to The Great Dictator, which is a film that pretty much changed the game for Charlie Chaplin in more ways than one. Because The Great Dictator was a film that was much more spurred from his desire to critique fascism. Now, The Great Dictator did have roadblocks as it was trying to get made, and mostly it was because of financing. Studios weren't willing to make a film or even produce a film that was in favor of critiquing the Nazi Party, considering that there were open Nazi parties in California and in the United States itself. And so Charlie Chaplin took it upon himself to use $2 million of his own budget to make this entire film. The film also had production issues as well, especially with the final scene, which took an extra 100 days to try to make, because the ending had to be rewritten, had to be reworked, and originally it was supposed to be a scene where all the Nazis danced at the end after Hinckel's speech, or not Hinckel's speech, but the Tramp's speech as Hinckel in the final scene, which we'll talk about later. But apparently that didn't go over so well for the people who were viewing the film, so that scene got cut in favor of a more simple speech to the audience. And so, after over 500 days of production time, the film was done shooting, and the editing took place and was officially released in 1940. to mixed results, as it were. Critics at the time really enjoyed the film, mostly saying that it was a brilliant takedown of a fascistic leader over in, well, Germany. The general public, however, was much more mixed. They thought it was very proselytizing. It was very preachy to them. It wasn't very funny. But nowadays, in my opinion, I think it's one of the more stronger satires that we've seen. And if this movie had not been released, we probably wouldn't have people like Mel Brooks or even Taika Waititi's films. Because it did open the door necessarily to political satire. And a lot of political satire can be hit or miss, but it did open up the doors for these creators to come in. And thusly, we have the beginnings of the anti-fascist film. So what is The Great Dictator even about? Well, The Great Dictator follows the tramp, or rather the barber, as he is in a coma after experiencing a plane crash in World War I. He wakes up in his home country of Tomania under a dictatorial rule by Hinkle. Both the barber and Hinkle are played by the same actor, Charlie Chaplin. And this film basically follows both sides of the story. The barber comes home and finds that Jewish people have been kind of discriminated against. And then on the other side of the coin, on the other side of this story, we have Hinkle, a Hitler lookalike, a Hitler sound-alike that is very bloated. A lot of the comedy in this film is related to Hinkle himself. Hinkle, as a character, is very delusional, very dumb. I think the scene that best epitomizes the both satire and comedy of Charlie Chaplin's Hinkle is best described in this scene in The Great Dictator, a scene that is referring to the globe. In this scene, we see Hinkle. He's in his room, in his lovely stateroom, full of nothing but air, and he sees the globe. He's been told that he can do great things. He can go and conquer the world. And in this scene, we see him play around with the world. And it shows how naive he is. It shows how vindictive he is. How he lusts for power, and he's willing to play with the world in order to get to it. And in a way, he's willing to play his citizens. He's willing to play other people in order to get what he wants, and that is the whole world in his hands. Now, the scene itself is also pretty hilarious, considering the fact that, Hinkle himself just kind of bounces the ball everywhere. Because you would think that, with the globe itself, it's one of those wooden ones. But no, it's a balloon. He plays with it like a plaything. And that is basically the biggest critique of Hitler that you could ever have in a 10-minute scene like this. It's him literally playing with the world like he's God or something. He's just playing around with it like he's also a child. And that is the biggest key critique of Hitler in this film, is that Hitler, as well as the Nazi Party, are all fucking idiots. They're all kids who desire to have power, but they're all kind of dumb. Does this film really hold up, though? Because after this film was released, Charlie Chaplin didn't really know about what was going on in Germany. No one did. And it wasn't until that we saw much of what happened after we had won the war. It wasn't until we went to Germany in 43 and 44 that we found out about the Holocaust. And Charlie Chaplin, years later, had remarked that if he had known about the horrors of the Holocaust, he would not have made this film. He would not have made a film where Hitler played around with the world. He would not have made a film where Hitler and a stand-in for Mussolini would fight with baguettes. But as much as he regretted making this film after, I really appreciate this film, because without this film, we wouldn't have what we got with the producers, and we most likely would not have gotten this scene from Jojo Rabbit.
No.
A little higher, just a little higher, please.
Fuck off, Hitler.
Now, I will say, The Great Dictator is not a perfect film. It's a film that is very long, and it's very repetitive at times. And I think if it were made today, it probably would have been at least 15 minutes shorter, and it would have had a much more condensed storyline. The thing that allows people to remember The Great Dictator isn't just the slapstick comedy. It isn't just the scathing critique and satire of Hinkle. It isn't the fact that they show the brutality that was being shown to Jewish people, even though, again, before the Holocaust was even known about. The key thing that people remember most about this movie is the ending speech. And as I said before, this ending had a huge production issue. It was an ending that originally, by the end of the speech, the quote-unquote Nazis, or the double cross, as they are referred to as in the film, they would dance because it was a celebration of, humanity. But it just doesn't work like that. I feel like if you were to watch this scene and then follow it up with a dance sequence, it would seem in very poor taste, and I'm glad that Charlie Chaplin decided against it. More rather, the film, instead of being a grand finale full of music and dance, it goes for a much more somber piece. And this piece is not performed by Hinkle, and it's not performed by the barber. It's simply a monologue that was written purely from Charlie Chaplin. This scene is partly why some audiences felt talked down to. It's referring to you, the audience. It literally breaks the fourth wall and addresses the audience. It's a speech that is very memorable, and it's a speech that pretty much got him in trouble. Because you see, after this film was released, the FBI, or even before then, the FBI was very much into investigating Charlie Chaplin. They thought he was a socialist. They thought he was a person that was going to betray the country. And thusly, after Charlie Chaplin left the country for a holiday over in England, he was barred from ever returning again. Ever. Now granted, he did return, I think in the 70s, to try to get an honorary Oscar award, but most of the time he was basically exiled for life because of the fact that he made a film that its core message is about helping other people. The speech itself is very memorable because it touches on so much of what makes humanity humanity. It begs and it asks people to set aside the differences of skin color and ethnicity and basically help each other. And if that is a radical message, then I don't know what is, because I find it very odd when I really look at the history of The Great Dictator. I really find it odd that Charlie Chaplin, for just talking about basic human decency and human kindness, would be barred from ever being able to visit the very place where he built his dreams, where he built his empire of comedy. And in that respect, in the respect of that final speech, in the respect of the film itself, I really enjoy this film. Not because it's funny or because it's hugely entertaining, but because it actually had something to say during a time when the industry itself did not want to say anything. And it's important that artists say things. A lot of people will say, art doesn't have to say anything. That's true. Some art doesn't necessarily have to say anything in order to be an enjoyable movie. But sometimes you have to speak up about things that matter most. Documentaries do it all the time. Why can't fictitious films? Why can't we have political satire? Why can't we do this and why can't we do that? And I think it's more important now than ever that we need more films that actually discuss actual topics like this. Topics like abortion rights, or marijuana rights, or gay rights, transgender rights. We need more films like this. And the fact that Hollywood, continuing with the tradition from the past, still gatekeeping the fact that they have all the money in the world to produce their films, but they don't want to have films with, a same-sex couple wanting to have a kiss in an animated kids film. Looking at you, Disney. The Great Dictator is a film that I wholeheartedly believe in. Its message, its comedy, its laughter. It teaches us that the darkest of people we should be able to laugh at and critique. It's a film that espouses human kindness in the wake of darkness. And it's a film definitely worthy of being in the Criterion Collection. It's a film that is historic in what it's trying to say. Even though it doesn't say it necessarily as well as some other films that have been made after this film. It laid the groundwork. And that's all you can really ask for with a film like The Great Dictator. It's a trailblazing film. Even if it's not perfect. Even if it's bloated in its runtime, and even if it doesn't necessarily work all the time. It's a film that works because of what it's trying to do. And that's all you can really say with this film. This has been the Criterion Corner. Peace.
We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without those qualities, life will be violent and all will be lost. The world responded not only to the wondrous humor of the little tramp, but also to the love and indomitability he represents, to Chaplin's soaring theme that man's humanity to man is greater than his inhumanity.